and welcome to the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from 104.9. I'm Paul Kretschmer. We're going to be looking into the question of how this country works, biblical or not. My guest on today's broadcast is Mark Burrell.
Yeah, so my name's Mark Burrell, and I've written a book called Rediscovering the American Covenant, Roadmap to Restore America. And what makes this particular book unique is that I start with the Bible, looking for answers to the question of what does the Christian faith really have to offer with respect to governing. And if you look at what the modern church has been saying over the last 50 years or so, you might think it has nothing to say because it doesn't say much about that. It really just says submit and pray. And when I went through and looked at the Bible, I found there were actually thousands of verses that talked about our responsibility to help establish liberty and justice for all in the communities and nations in which we live. Further, I found that the founding, what the founders did during the founding of our country is they applied these principles to the letter. And so what I'm really trying to do with the book is to help people rediscover the covenant that really binds us all together and gives us our unique American identity. And my assertion, Paul, is that this is the root cause problem in America today. It's that we have a significant number of our fellow citizens who have fundamentally rejected our national founding covenant. Our problem is not that they're not following the Constitution. That is a problem, but that's not the root cause problem. Bad policy isn't the root cause problem. The root cause problem is that we have this group that has fundamentally rejected our national founding covenant. And so my assertion is that we've got to talk about that if we want to restore America.
How does a conversation like that begin when there is so much contention between various aspects of the population then, sir?
Yeah, so it really depends on the audience. So I'm going to give you a real-life example. I work in corporate America, and I've had conversations with nearly 24 of my senior leaders where I go in and basically start with, I have some concerns with our diversity and inclusion program. And I'd like to talk to you about that. And my basic assertion is that if we're really going to be inclusive of everyone, then we really need to adopt a liberty position. And then I proceed to talk about, there's two worldviews, and I explain the worldviews. And I really just go in explaining versus, defending or arguing or debating. And I found that has worked tremendously well. I can tell you that a lot of the senior leaders, at least in my company, don't know a lot about these principles. I had one senior leader recently tell me that he didn't know what the word woke meant. I used it in a sentence. And he was like, wait, what's that mean? And so what I have found is if you go in saying, I'd just like to share some concerns in that particular venue, and it's worked pretty well. And so, obviously it depends on your audience, and you have to adapt it. But you can start with a broad question like, do you believe in freedom? Do you want to be told what to believe? And then you can start to talk about, there's a couple of worldviews at play here, and a lot of people have no idea that that's the case. They've just been so programmed to demonize, one side or the other, and you can't even get to a productive conversation. So, yeah, it's worked rather well, but it's taken a while for me to learn how to do that. And really, the book is meant to help re-educate people so that they can have similar conversations.
When you have people who come from orientations that have very hardened positions, is it possible to reasonably converse with someone like that? Or is there some spade work that the thoughtful Christian can use to become more approachable to someone like that without compromising your faith position?
Yeah, there absolutely is. In fact, I was talking with a group just last week, and I was talking to them about the approach that I just shared with you. And I told them before I got started, I said, you have to change your orientation. This group of people is very politically engaged, informed. And the first thing I told them is, you've got to put that aside, because your goal isn't to defend or argue, it's to explain. And so if you're talking to someone about their point of view, and they're, progressive or even hard left, and they say something like, I believe in LGBT rights, or I believe in gender transition, I believe in fill in the blank, the most outrageous thing that they can say. And I told that group, you have to be ready to let that go and just say, if you have a progressive worldview, I understand why you would feel that way. And that's the answer. And then you go on to explain, understand that we have different worldviews. And my worldview is based on the Bible, and that's what informed our founding. And I explain this thoroughly in the book, making the direct connection between biblical passages and the Declaration itself. And then they can say, no, that you have a different point of view because your side rejects the idea of objective truth. You reject the idea of the law of nature and of nature's God, which is in the Declaration, and it's a reference to the moral law. So, and then you can have a conversation about, once you do that, really anything is possible. And again, you do it in an explaining way versus an argumentative way. And that's the key.
As I view the Christian community nationwide right now, it looks to me as a person and as a journalist that sometimes believers feel or act as if they have to do the whole works themselves, and they take election wins or losses as a grade for how well or not they're doing their work. Can you share what you feel is the appropriate action to take, which would be to be steeped deeply in prayer and remember that it's not up to us to come up with a final solution, but rather we are serving the Lord and He's the one who ultimately is in charge of the results?
Yeah, that is a perfect question, because it speaks to the point I make in the book around what has to happen in order to restore America. Because a lot of Christians who are politically engaged are looking at this like, we've got to try harder. It's sort of up to us. And the founders didn't see it that way. If you read the Declaration, the thing that's so impressive about the back half of it anyway, is that they make a direct appeal to God. They say, appealing to the supreme ruler of the universe for the rectitude of our intentions, the truthfulness of our intentions, and then pledging their lives and their fortunes and their sacred honor. Basically what they're doing is appealing to God and committing it, and then they declared it, which is really, these are the key steps. It's to appeal, acknowledge God's moral law, to commit to it, and they did that by signing it, and then declare those 4 steps. It turns out those are the 4 steps you take in any serious covenant, like a marriage. It's the same thing. And so what I maintain we have to do in the book, if we're going to turn things around, is we almost have to put our political activities on hold for a moment. And for those of us who love America and want to see it restored, like the small group that, it was a minority, it was anything but a strong majority, by the way, during the colonial era. They came together and they said, we're going to do this, and we're appealing to God and so forth, and God blessed their effort. And by the way, this is biblical. If you look at the Old Testament, when Israel got in a real bad way, most of their kings were lousy, but they did have a few good ones. Josiah, for instance, he was the king when they went in to clean the temple, and they found the book of the law, and they read it, and they realized that they were not keeping it. And what did he do? He went out and gathered the people together, and he said, let's recommit. We're going to recommit to this covenant, and God blessed the ring. And essentially that's what I'm saying we've got to do as a nation. We've got to come together, recommit to the Declaration. We need to do it in a public way. Maybe put it online and have people go on and sign it, make it easy for everyone to put their name to it, and get God to engage. That is the biblical approach, to get God to engage, which is what we desperately need. Then we resume our political efforts, and God will either bless it or He won't. But I know for a fact, reading the Bible, that until we make that formal appeal, we're not going to have his help. So that's the point I make in the book.
How about the position of some people who say the U.S. Constitution is not written on stone tablets? It's not frozen. It's a living, breathing document, and it has to be adjusted from time to time to respond to things that are happening. People up to even to the President of the United States in recent memory has suggested that it's a living, breathing document, which is the antithesis of what Justice Antonin Scalia, for instance, would have said.
Yeah, this is clever use of language, right? Because we know that the Constitution is amendable. We can have amendments if we all agree to pass them and then get the states to ratify it. But what's really unyielding is this notion of the law of nature and of nature's God, which again goes back to the Declaration. That's direct reference to the moral law, summarized by the Ten Commandments. This is why the Ten Commandments were hung in almost every schoolroom and courtroom up until the late 19th century, which the Supreme Court suddenly decided it was unconstitutional and people started to remove them. That is what is completely immovable. And as Christians, if you just step out of this political conversation, you can ask a Christian, what makes you a Christian? And the answer is, well, I'm a sinner. I've accepted I'm a sinner, and I've asked Jesus to forgive my sins, and I've accepted him as my Savior. My next question is, well, what is sin? And the answer is, it's a transgression of the moral law, the Ten Commandments, which, of course, we're all guilty of. And so it logically follows, then, that we want to live our lives according to the moral law as best we can. And in the political sense, any laws passed to be legitimate must be in harmony with the moral law. That's the part that's completely immovable. So, for instance, this Respect for Marriage Act that was recently passed, that's a great example of a law that's not legitimate because it's not in harmony. It contrasts. It's contrary to the moral law on the question of marriage. And so this is what Christians need to relearn and get conviction to defend and recognize that is what's immovable. But we can certainly amend the Constitution. Is it living? Well, not in the sense that progressives are trying to make it living. It is amendable, but that's the difference. But it all goes back to the Declaration, our founding covenant.
In terms of your work on this book, when did you start doing that, and what kind of time passage took place while you were working on it?
So I got serious about my faith in the late 80s. I found a mentor who basically took me through theology. I was really blessed, gave me a reading list, and I started building a library, sort of seminary school the old-fashioned way, sitting under the feet of someone who was very experienced. And around that time is when I also started to hear the negative narrative of America, and that we were racist and all these negative things. And I thought to myself, the question that started to bother me was, if Jesus said you should pay your taxes, but the revolution was all about taxation without representation, and they basically didn't want to pay their taxes, then how could the whole thing be biblically justifiable? That was the question I started with back in the late 80s, early 90s. And I thought to myself, I ought to figure that out at some point. And I thought it would be a side issue, frankly. So throughout the 90s, I started to pick up books on the topic and read more about it.
Thank you for your time, sir. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Been great talking with you, too.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a conversation I had with Mark Burrell for today's WIHS Journal broadcast. Call us at 860-346-1049 for further information, 860-346-1049. Or you can email us, office@wihsradio.org, office@wihsradio.org. Opinions expressed are those of the participants, not necessarily those of the staff or management of the station. I'm Paul Kretschmer on the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from 104.9 WIHS.